The hall was already half full when she walked in. Soft music played through the speakers while people found their seats and adjusted their clothes. The lights above the stage were warm and bright, making the black grand piano shine like glass. It stood in the center, quiet and proud, as if waiting for someone important. She paused near the entrance. For a moment, she just looked at everything. The chairs arranged in neat rows. The small stage decorated with white curtains. The microphone standing to the side. And the piano. Her shoes were slightly worn. Her dress was simple and clean but not fancy like the others. Around her, people were dressed in polished shoes, shiny watches, and carefully styled hair. Some were parents. Some were music teachers. Some were students waiting for their turn to perform. She stayed close to the wall at first. The sound of laughter floated around her. It wasn't cruel, just light conversation. Still, she felt small in that space. She wasn't officially on the program list. She hadn't been invited as a performer. She had come with someone older who believed in her. Someone who had quietly asked the organizers earlier if she could get a small chance to play if time allowed. The answer had been uncertain. A maybe. She held that maybe in her heart like something fragile. Her eyes kept returning to the piano. She had seen pianos before, but not like this. Not one this large. Not one sitting under soft golden lights. At home, she practiced on an old keyboard with a few faded keys. Sometimes certain notes didn't even sound right. But she had learned to adjust. She had learned to imagine the music even when the instrument wasn't perfect. Now, seeing this piano felt different. Felt alive. She didn't mean to walk toward it. Her feet just moved slowly, step by step, as if pulled by something gentle. The closer she got, the more she could see her reflection on its smooth surface. Her small figure looked even smaller against its size. A few people noticed her moving near the stage. At first, no one said anything. She reached the steps and hesitated. The stage seemed higher than it actually was. Her heart began to beat faster. Maybe she should wait. Maybe she should go back to her seat. But the piano was right there. She carefully stepped up. The sound in the room did not stop, but it shifted. A few whispers started. A woman in the second row leaned toward the person next to her and asked something quietly. A group of teenagers near the back looked at each other and smiled in confusion. Was she performing now? Was she part of the program? She walked toward the piano slowly, almost respectfully, like someone approaching something sacred. When she reached it, she didn't sit down immediately. She simply stood there. Then, very gently, she lifted her hand and touched one key. Just one. The note rang out, clear and soft. It wasn't loud, but in that moment, it felt like everyone heard it. A small laugh came from somewhere in the audience. Then another. It wasn't loud laughter. It wasn't shouting. It was the kind of laughter people make when they think something is a little foolish. A little out of place. Someone whispered, "Is she supposed to be up there?" Another voice said quietly, "Does she even know how to play?" The words were not meant to hurt her, but they did. Her hand quickly pulled back from the key as if it had burned her. She hadn't expected the room to feel so big all of a sudden. Just a minute ago it felt magical. Now it felt heavy. She looked out at the crowd. Dozens of eyes were on her. Some curious. Some confused. Some amused. Her cheeks grew warm. She could feel it. For a second, she thought about stepping down and pretending it was a mistake. She could say she was just looking. Just curious. No harm done. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides. From the corner of her eye, she saw the person who had brought her there, standing near the wall, watching carefully, not smiling, not worried, just steady. Their eyes met. There was no big gesture, no dramatic nod, just a calm expression that seemed to say, "It's okay." The laughter didn't grow, but the whispers continued. A man near the aisle shook his head lightly as if already expecting this to end awkwardly. One of the organizers stood up halfway from their chair, unsure if they should step in. She swallowed. The stage lights felt warmer now, brighter, almost too bright. She looked back at the piano. The keys were still, waiting. She remembered the first time she had touched a keyboard. It wasn't in a hall like this. It was in a small room with peeling paint and a flickering tube light. The keyboard had been a gift from someone who saw her pressing random keys on a neighbor's instrument and noticed something in her eyes. She hadn't known the names of the notes back then. She had just listened carefully to how each sound felt, how pressing harder changed the tone, how certain combinations made her chest feel full. She had practiced every day after that, sometimes before school, sometimes late at night, sometimes when the electricity went out. She would imagine the keys under her fingers and move her hands in the air. No one had laughed then, because no one had been watching. But now everyone was watching, and some were laughing. Her chest rose and fell slowly as she took a deep breath. The organizer, who had half stood, sat back down again, still unsure. She reached for the piano bench. The small movement made a slight scraping sound against the stage floor. It echoed more than it should have. A few more soft chuckles. She adjusted the bench, trying to remember how her teacher once told her to sit straight. Not too close, not too far. Her hands hovered above the keys again. They trembled slightly, not because she didn't know what to do, but because she knew that whatever she did next would matter. In the audience, someone muttered, "This will be quick." Another voice replied, "Poor thing." She heard enough to understand the meaning, even if she didn't catch every word. For a second, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if the big piano felt different from the small keyboard? What if her fingers forgot what they had learned? What if the first real song she played here turned into a mistake? Her heart beat loudly in her ears. But then something inside her shifted. She realized something simple. They were already expecting her to fail. There was nothing to lose. If she stood up now, they would forget her in a few minutes. If she played badly, they would forget her too. But if she didn't try, she would remember it forever. The hall slowly quieted. Not completely, but enough. Curiosity began to replace laughter. People leaned slightly forward. Even those who had laughed wanted to see what would happen next. She closed her eyes for just a moment. In that brief darkness, the hall disappeared. The lights disappeared. The whispers disappeared. She was back in her small room, the old keyboard in front of her, the sound of distant traffic outside, her fingers moving slowly, carefully, again and again until a melody felt right. She placed her fingers on the keys. This time she didn't pull back. The first note had already been played. Now the real choice was about to begin, and the entire hall waited. Her fingers were still resting on the keys. The hall felt strangely quiet now, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence filled with waiting. Waiting for a mistake. Waiting for an awkward sound. Waiting for proof that she did not belong there. She slowly opened her eyes. From where she sat, the bright lights made it hard to see every face clearly, but she could still notice shapes and movements. Someone crossed their arms. Someone leaned back in their chair. A few people whispered again, thinking she could not hear. One of the teenagers near the back gave a small laugh and said something under his breath. The others beside him smiled. Her ears felt hot. She adjusted her fingers slightly, pressing one key softly, then another, just testing. The sound of the grand piano was deeper than what she was used to, richer. It vibrated through the stage and into her chest. For a brief second, fear returned. This instrument was powerful. It would not hide small mistakes the way her old keyboard sometimes did. Every note would be clear, honest. She lifted her hands again. A quiet voice from the side of the hall spoke gently to the organizer, asking if this was planned. The organizer gave a small shrug. No one truly knew what was happening anymore. The girl's breathing grew steady. Inhale, exhale. She remembered something important. Her teacher once told her, "Before you play, listen to the silence." At the time, she did not understand. Silence felt empty to her. But now, sitting in front of all these people, she understood. Silence was not empty. It was full of expectation. She decided not to rush. She let her fingers fall gently onto the first chord. This time, it was not just a random note. It was soft but firm. A complete sound. It floated into the air and did not shake. The whispering stopped for a second. She followed it with another chord. Then a single note that carried a simple melody. It was not fast. It was not loud. It was careful. Some people in the front row leaned forward slightly. The laughter from earlier did not continue. Now the room felt different. Not impressed. Not yet. But curious. She kept playing slowly, letting the melody unfold the way she had practiced many times. Her hands still trembled a little, but less than before. The more she focused on the keys, the less she thought about the faces in the crowd. A man near the aisle, who had earlier shaken his head, now sat straighter. He was listening more closely than he wanted to admit. In the back row, one of the teenagers stopped smiling. He did not clap or react. He just listened. The melody grew clearer. Her left hand began to add soft background notes. Not complicated, just steady support. Her right hand carried the main tune, simple but emotional. It was the kind of melody that felt familiar, even if someone had never heard it before. Her shoulders slowly relaxed. With every note, she felt a small piece of fear leave her body. She remembered long evenings when she practiced the same part again and again because it did not sound right. She remembered the frustration of missing a key, the way her fingers sometimes hurt, the way she almost gave up more than once. But she had never stopped. Now those quiet hours were guiding her hands. A woman in the second row placed her handbag on her lap and folded her hands together. Her expression changed from doubt to attention. The organizer, who had been ready to interrupt earlier, sat back completely in their chair. The girl did not look up. She was no longer playing to prove something. She was playing because the music felt real inside her. The notes slowly became stronger. Not louder in a harsh way, but more confident. Her fingers moved more smoothly now, sliding from one key to another without hesitation. The melody started to rise, building gently like a story unfolding. The hall was fully quiet. No whispers, no laughter, only the sound of the piano. She felt the difference in the air. It no longer felt heavy, felt focused. A small mistake almost happened when her finger brushed the wrong edge of a key, but she adjusted quickly. No one seemed to notice. If they did not react. Instead of panic, she felt calm. She allowed the music to breathe. A small pause between phrases. Then a softer section that felt almost like a whisper. Someone in the audience let out a slow breath they didn't realize they were holding. Her confidence grew with each passing second. She had started unsure, almost fragile. But now there was strength in her posture. Her back was straight. Her wrists were relaxed. Her fingers moved with purpose. The melody shifted slightly, becoming more emotional. It was no longer just careful notes. Carried feeling. The kind of feeling that comes from longing, from quiet dreams, from hours spent alone with nothing but sound for company. An older man in the third row, who had attended many performances before, tilted his head slightly. He recognized something. Not perfection, but sincerity. That was harder to find. The teenagers at the back were no longer smiling. One of them leaned his elbows on his knees, watching closely. The woman who had whispered earlier now had her eyes fixed on the stage. The girl still did not look up. She was lost in the music now. Her left hand moved deeper into the lower notes, adding warmth. Her right hand climbed higher, letting the melody shine. The sound filled the hall completely. It no longer felt like a child experimenting with keys. Felt like a story being told. She remembered how people used to say that music was only for those who could afford lessons, proper instruments, big opportunities. She remembered hearing someone once say that talent without support goes nowhere. But sitting there now, she realized something else. Music did not ask where you came from. It only asked how much of your heart you were willing to give. She pressed into a stronger section of the piece. The volume increased, but it was controlled. Not chaotic. Not rushed. The sound of the grand piano responded beautifully, each note ringing clear and full. The hall seemed smaller now. Not physically smaller, but closer. The distance between her and the audience felt shorter. The same people who had doubted her were now completely still. A child in the front row stopped fidgeting and stared at her hands. The organizer slowly folded their arms, not in doubt this time, but in thought. The melody reached a turning point, a place where it could either fall apart or rise higher. Her heart beat faster again, but this time it was not fear. It was momentum. She moved into the next part without hesitation. Her fingers danced more freely now, not wildly, but with grace. The music began to bloom, filling every corner of the room. No one laughed anymore. No one whispered. No one questioned whether she belonged there. They were no longer thinking about her clothes or how she walked onto the stage without announcement. They were only listening. And for the first time since she stepped into that hall, she felt like she truly belonged exactly where she was. The girl who had been mocked just minutes ago was no longer seen as someone out of place. She was becoming something else entirely, and the performance had only just begun. The music continued to rise, and with it, something inside her began to change. At first, she had played carefully, almost like she was asking permission to stay on that stage. But now, her hands were no longer asking. They were speaking. The melody grew deeper. Her left hand moved confidently across the lower keys, creating a steady rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Her right hand carried the tune higher, letting it shine above everything else. The sound filled the hall completely. No one shifted in their seats anymore. No one looked at their phones. Even the air seemed still. She did not notice how many people were staring at her now. She did not see the way the man in the aisle leaned forward, elbows on his knees, listening closely. She did not see the woman in the second row slowly pressing her lips together, surprised at her own reaction. She was somewhere else. In her mind, she was back in her small room again. The paint on the walls slightly faded. The window half open. The soft evening light falling across the old keyboard. She remembered how her fingers used to stumble over the difficult parts of this very piece. How many times she had stopped, sighed, and started again. There were nights when she almost gave up. She remembered sitting alone, staring at the keys, thinking maybe the laughter she heard today would always follow her. Maybe people would always see her as someone who didn't belong in places like that hall. But every time she felt like quitting, she would play again. Not because someone forced her, but because when she played, she felt understood. Now, sitting in front of a grand piano for the first time, she felt that same understanding. Only stronger. The piece moved into a softer section. Her fingers slowed down, pressing the keys gently. The notes sounded like quiet whispers floating through the room. The sudden softness made the audience hold their breath again. It was not just about playing correctly anymore. It was about telling a story. And she was telling it honestly. A small child in the front row tilted their head, watching her hands move with curiosity. The earlier laughter from the back of the hall felt like something from another day. It seemed impossible that just minutes ago, people were smiling at her in doubt. The teenager who had laughed earlier now sat completely still. His eyes were fixed on the stage, his expression serious. He did not clap yet. He did not react. But he was listening in a way he hadn't before. The girl's confidence continued to grow. She let her wrists relax more. She allowed the notes to flow naturally instead of forcing them. The grand piano responded beautifully, each sound rich and full, echoing softly off the walls. She began to feel something new. Not fear. Not even nervousness. Pride. Not the loud kind that shows on the outside, but the quiet kind that warms your chest from within. Her shoulders were no longer tense. Her back was straight. Her breathing steady. The music slowly began to build again. The gentle whispers of notes turned into stronger phrases. Her fingers moved faster now, but not rushed. There was control in every movement. The hall felt smaller, closer. She could sense the attention of every person in the room, but it no longer scared her. Instead, it gave her energy. Each note seemed to erase a little more of the doubt that had filled the room earlier. The organizer, who had once considered stopping her, now watched with folded hands and wide eyes. There was no confusion on their face anymore. Only surprise. A man in the third row slowly shook his head, not in disbelief, but in quiet admiration. The music reached another turning point. This was the part she used to struggle with most. The part where the rhythm changes suddenly. where both hands must move quickly and precisely together. Her heart beat faster again. For a split second, a small thought tried to interrupt her focus. What if she makes a mistake now? But she pushed the thought away. Mistakes were part of learning. She had made hundreds during practice, and she had learned from each one. She pressed into the next section with courage. Her fingers moved confidently across the keys. The rhythm shifted smoothly. The sound became bold and alive, filling the hall with strength. There was no laughter now. There was no whispering. Only silence and music. Even those who did not understand classical music could feel something different happening. The performance was not perfect in a technical sense. It was not polished in the way professionals perform on grand stages. But it was real. And real is powerful. Her right hand flew over the higher keys, creating bright notes that sparkled in the air. Her left hand followed with steady, grounding tones. The sound wrapped around the audience like a warm wave. Someone in the back quietly said, "Wow," without even realizing it. The girl still did not look up. She did not need to. She could feel the change in the room. The same people who had doubted her were now sitting in complete focus. Some leaned forward. Some held their hands together. Some simply stared, as if afraid that moving would break the moment. Her fingers began the final build of this section. The music grew louder, stronger, more confident. Felt like a statement. Not an angry statement. Not a proud one. But a clear one. "I belong here." The grand piano responded with power. Each chord rang clearly, echoing slightly before fading into the next. Her hands moved with a rhythm that felt natural now. There was no hesitation left. No trembling. Only flow. She had stopped thinking about herself completely. She was not thinking about her dress. Not thinking about the laughter. Not thinking about the whispers. She was only thinking about the music. And that was when something truly shifted. The audience was no longer watching a girl trying to prove herself. They were watching a musician. The difference was subtle, but it was real. The music softened once more, preparing for the next emotional rise. Her fingers slowed, pressing the keys gently as if closing one chapter before opening another. The hall felt peaceful, almost sacred. The air carried the final notes of this part of the piece like fragile glass. When she played the last chord of this section, she let it ring. She did not rush into the next phrase. She allowed the sound to fade naturally. In that fading sound, something invisible changed completely. The doubt that had once filled the room was gone. The laughter had disappeared. In its place was something much stronger. Respect. She took a small breath. Her hands hovered above the keys again, preparing for what would come next. And for the first time since she stepped onto that stage, she felt no fear at all. The last chord from the previous section slowly faded into silence. She let it disappear fully before moving again. The quiet in the hall felt different now. It was no longer heavy with doubt. It was full of attention. Every person in that room was waiting, not for her to fail, but to see what she would do next. She took a slow breath. Her fingers lowered again, and this time the music began with more strength. The new section opened with a deeper sound from the lower keys. It was bold but not harsh. The grand piano responded with a rich tone that seemed to travel through the floor and into the seats. It felt almost like a heartbeat spreading through the hall. Her right hand followed with a clear, steady melody. It was stronger than before, confident, sure of itself. She was no longer testing the instrument. She was commanding it. In the front row, a woman who had once whispered leaned forward even more. Her eyes were fixed on the stage. She no longer saw a nervous girl in simple clothes. She saw focus, control, emotion. The teenager in the back who had laughed earlier now sat completely still. His arms, once folded in amusement, were resting on his knees. He did not smile anymore. His expression was serious, almost thoughtful. The organizer watched carefully. There was a small change in their face too. A softness. A quiet realization that something special was happening. On stage, she felt the shift but did not look up to confirm it. She did not need to. The way the room held its silence told her everything. The music grew faster. Her fingers moved across the keys with more energy now. The rhythm picked up, and the melody began to climb higher. Felt like a story reaching an important moment. Her hands were steady. The trembling from earlier was gone. Each movement felt natural, as if the keys were guiding her fingers instead of the other way around. She remembered the first time she practiced this faster part. She had struggled. Her fingers had felt stiff. She had stopped again and again, frustrated that she could not get it right. There had been no audience then. No bright lights. Just her and the quiet room. Now, sitting in front of so many people, the part that once felt impossible flowed smoothly under her hands. The sound of the grand piano filled every corner of the hall. It was no longer just music in the background. It was the center of everything. A small child in the front row smiled without knowing why. The melody was not childish or playful, but it carried something honest that even a child could feel. The music began to rise again. This time, the build was stronger than before. Her left hand moved confidently between lower chords, creating a powerful foundation. Her right hand danced above it, weaving the main tune with clarity and feeling. She leaned slightly forward, not out of nervousness, but out of connection. She was fully inside the music now. In the audience, someone quietly wiped their eyes. They were not sure why they felt emotional. The piece was not sad in a dramatic way. It was simply real. The man in the aisle, who had doubted her at first, slowly nodded his head to the rhythm. He did not even realize he was doing it. The music reached a louder point. Her fingers pressed into the keys with controlled strength. The sound became bold and bright, echoing beautifully. It did not feel forced. Felt earned. Every note carried meaning. Every chord felt deliberate. She was not trying to impress anyone anymore. She was simply playing the music the way she felt it. The hall seemed smaller now, not because it had changed, but because the distance between her and the audience had disappeared. They were no longer separate groups. They were connected by sound. The faster section grew even more energetic. Her hands moved quickly, but they did not rush. There was balance between speed and control. She had practiced this balance for months without knowing that one day she would perform it on a stage like this. The earlier laughter felt like a distant memory. Now, if anyone in the room thought about those first moments, they probably felt embarrassed. But she did not think about it. She was too focused on what was happening right now. The music began to soften again, but this time it did not return to uncertainty. It softened with purpose, preparing for something bigger. Her fingers slowed slightly, allowing each note to breathe. The melody turned gentle but strong at the same time. The room remained completely silent except for the piano. Even the air conditioner seemed quieter. She moved into the final rise of this section. Her heart beat faster, but not from fear. It was excitement. The kind of excitement that comes when you know you are giving your best. Her hands climbed higher on the keyboard. The sound became brighter, almost shining. The grand piano responded with full power, each note ringing clear and alive. Some people in the audience felt chills run down their arms. They could not explain it. They did not need to. The music was speaking clearly enough. She pressed into the strongest chords of the piece so far. Not wildly, not out of control, but with confidence that surprised even herself. Her posture was strong, her expression calm, her eyes focused on the keys. In that moment, she did not look like someone who had walked onto the stage by accident. She looked like someone who had been preparing for this moment her whole life. The melody soared, then slowly began to descend. Her hands moved gracefully down the keyboard, guiding the music back to a softer place. Felt like reaching the top of a hill and slowly walking back down. The audience followed every step. No one whispered. No one moved. The connection between her and the room was complete now. She played the final chords of this section with deep emotion, allowing each one to ring fully before moving to the next. The sound filled the hall one last time before settling into a gentle calm. When she reached the final note of this part, she pressed it softly but firmly. She let it echo. The note floated in the air, slowly fading. She kept her hands on the keys even after the sound disappeared. No one clapped yet. No one made a sound. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was powerful. It was the kind of silence that happens when people are processing something unexpected. She finally lifted her hands slowly from the keys. For a brief second, everything was still. And in that stillness, everyone in the hall understood one simple truth. The girl they had mocked for touching the piano was no longer someone to doubt. She had already left them stunned. And the performance was not even over yet. The silence after the last note felt heavier than any sound she had played. Her fingers were still resting lightly above the keys, not touching them, just hovering. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest, steady but strong. For a brief second, she wondered if she had imagined everything. The shift in the room, the change in the faces, the stillness. Then she slowly lifted her hands into her lap. The hall remained completely quiet. No one rushed to clap. No one spoke. It was not because they were unimpressed. It was because they were caught in the moment. The music had not simply ended. It had settled into them. She finally looked up. It was the first time since she began playing that she allowed herself to really see the audience. The same people who had whispered earlier were now staring at her with wide eyes. Some looked surprised. Some looked thoughtful. A few looked slightly embarrassed. The teenager in the back who had laughed before was no longer smiling. His expression had changed completely. He glanced down for a second, as if thinking about something, then looked back at her with quiet respect. The man in the aisle slowly shook his head again, but this time it was not doubt. It was disbelief in a different way, disbelief that he had judged too quickly. A woman in the second row pressed her hands together and let out a soft breath, as if she had been holding it the entire time. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the hall, one person began to clap. It was not loud at first, just two hands coming together, breaking the silence. Another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause. It was not polite clapping. It was strong, real, honest. Some people even stood up without thinking about it. She blinked, slightly overwhelmed. The sound of the applause was louder than the piano had been. It wrapped around her like a wave. For a moment, she did not know what to do. She had imagined this moment in small ways while practicing alone, but imagining something and living it were very different. Her first instinct was to look down again. But instead, she stayed still and let herself feel it. The applause continued. She could see smiles now. Not the amused smiles from earlier, but proud ones. Impressed ones. The organizer stood up fully this time, clapping with genuine admiration. Their earlier uncertainty had completely disappeared. She slowly stood from the bench. Her legs felt slightly shaky, but not from fear. From emotion. From relief. She turned slightly toward the audience and gave a small bow. It was not dramatic. It was simple, sincere. The applause grew even louder. In the back row, the teenagers who had once laughed were clapping too. One of them even stood up, not because others were standing, but because he wanted to. The shift in the room was complete. Just minutes ago, she had walked onto the stage as someone people questioned. Now she stood there as someone they respected. The applause slowly began to settle, though it did not stop completely. A few people continued clapping longer than the others. She glanced toward the side of the hall where the person who had brought her stood. Their eyes were shining, not with surprise, but with quiet pride. They had believed in her before anyone else did. She felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not pride in proving others wrong, but gratitude for not walking away when she had the chance. The organizer stepped closer to the stage and gestured kindly, inviting her to stay a moment longer. They picked up the microphone. Their voice sounded different now, softer. They admitted, in simple words, that they had not expected this. That sometimes talent appears in unexpected ways. That the hall had just witnessed something special. She listened quietly, still trying to process everything. A few people in the audience nodded in agreement. The organizer then turned toward her and asked gently how long she had been playing. She hesitated for a second, not used to speaking into microphones or in front of crowds. But she answered honestly. She spoke about practicing at home, about learning slowly, about loving the sound of the keys even when no one else was listening. Her voice was soft but clear. The hall listened carefully. No one laughed. No one whispered. Instead, there was a kind of respect in the air that had not been there before. After a few short questions, the organizer thanked her again and stepped back. The applause returned once more, lighter this time but still full of appreciation. She stepped down from the stage slowly. As her feet touched the floor, something felt different. The same hall, the same chairs, the same people, but the way they looked at her had changed. A woman near the aisle reached out gently and said she played beautifully. Her voice was kind and sincere. Another person smiled warmly and said they had not expected such depth. The teenager who had laughed earlier walked past her on the way out and paused. He did not speak loudly. He simply said, "That was really good," before continuing toward the door. It was a small sentence, but it meant something. She nodded politely, not wanting to make the moment uncomfortable. The person who had brought her walked up beside her and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. No big speech, no dramatic praise, just a quiet, proud smile. The hall slowly returned to its normal sounds. Chairs moved. Conversations started again. But the tone of those conversations was different now. People were not talking about whether she belonged. They were talking about how she had surprised them. Some even spoke about how quick they had been to judge. She sat down in one of the chairs near the back, finally allowing herself to breathe deeply. Her hands still felt warm from the keys. She looked down at them and smiled softly. Those same hands that had once trembled were steady now. She realized something important in that moment. The applause was beautiful. The compliments were kind. But the real victory had happened earlier. It had happened the second she chose to sit down despite the laughter. It had happened when she pressed the first real chord instead of walking away. The music had changed the room, but courage had changed her. As the next performer prepared to go on stage, she leaned back in her chair quietly. No one in that hall would forget what had just happened, and neither would she, because that night was not just about playing a piano. It was about standing firm when others doubted you. It was about letting your actions speak when words fall short. And it was about understanding that sometimes the most powerful response to mockery is not anger. It is excellence. She looked once more toward the stage. The grand piano still stood there under the lights, silent again. But it no longer felt distant. It felt like a door she had already walked through. And everyone in that hall knew they had witnessed something they did not expect. Something honest, something real. The girl who had once been mocked for touching the piano had done more than play. She had changed the way they saw her, and perhaps even the way they saw themselves. The event continued, but something in the hall had already changed. Even as the next performer walked onto the stage, people were still thinking about her. A few heads turned in her direction more than once. Conversations were softer now, more thoughtful. The earlier energy of quiet judgment had disappeared completely. She sat in her chair near the back, hands folded in her lap, trying to feel normal again. Her heart had finally slowed down, but her mind was still replaying everything. The first step onto the stage, the laughter, the whispers, the first brave chord, the silence, the applause. It all felt like a dream that had happened too quickly. The person who had brought her leaned closer and spoke softly, saying they were proud of her. Not in a loud, dramatic way. Just simple words. Honest words. She nodded, not trusting her voice yet. Across the room, a few people kept looking at her with small smiles. Not the kind that make someone uncomfortable. The kind that show respect. One of the organizers approached her after a while. Their expression was completely different from earlier. There was no hesitation now. They thanked her properly for playing. They admitted they had not expected such confidence. They even asked if she would consider performing again at a future event. The question surprised her. Earlier that evening, she had not even been sure she would be allowed to sit at the piano. Now someone was inviting her back. She answered politely, saying she would be honored. The organizer smiled warmly and moved on. As the program came closer to ending, people began gathering their things. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor. Soft conversations filled the hall again. But the tone was not careless anymore. Several parents walked past her and offered kind words. A music teacher stopped and said she had strong expression in her playing. An older man said he had attended many events in that hall and would remember her performance for a long time. Each comment felt unreal. She had not come there expecting praise. She had come hoping for a chance. And she had received much more than that. When the hall finally began to empty, she stood up slowly. The stage lights were dimmer now. The grand piano remained in the center, quiet once more. She looked at it one last time before leaving. It no longer looked intimidating. It looked familiar. As she stepped outside, the night air felt cool and calm. The noise of the city was softer compared to the noise inside her thoughts. For a few moments, she walked in silence. Then she said something she had been holding inside. She admitted that when the laughter started, she almost walked away. She almost stepped down from the stage. She almost decided that maybe the whispers were right. The person beside her listened carefully. They told her something simple. Courage is not about never feeling afraid. It is about choosing to stay when fear tells you to leave. Those words stayed with her. That night, when she returned home, she sat in front of her old keyboard again. The paint on the wall was still slightly faded. The room was still small. Nothing had changed physically, but she had changed. She pressed one key gently. The sound was softer than the grand piano, less powerful, slightly uneven, but it still carried music. She smiled to herself. She understood something clearly now. The power was never in the instrument. It was in the effort, the practice, the belief. The next morning, she woke up to something unexpected. Someone from the event had shared a short video of her performance online. It had been recorded quietly from the audience. The video was simple, not perfect quality, but it captured the moment when the hall went silent and the music began to rise. People were watching it, sharing it, commenting on it. Some praised her confidence. Some admitted they were surprised. Some wrote about how quick judgment can be wrong. She read a few comments quietly. There were kind words from strangers who had never been in that hall. They did not know about the laughter at the beginning. They only saw the performance. She closed the phone after a while. She did not want attention to distract her from what truly mattered. The most important moment had not been the applause. It had been the choice to sit down and play. Over the next few weeks, more small opportunities appeared. A school asked if she could perform at a program. A local group invited her to play at a small gathering. The same organizer from that night kept their promise and added her name officially to the next event schedule. Each time she walked toward a stage, she remembered the first one. The laughter, the whispers, and how quickly they disappeared once the music began. She no longer feared those reactions, because she had learned something powerful. People often judge quickly, but sound travels faster than doubt. Months later, when she returned to that same hall for another performance, the feeling was completely different. Her name was printed clearly on the program this time. People knew she was coming. There were no whispers when she approached the piano, only anticipation. As she sat down, she glanced briefly at the audience. She noticed a familiar face in the back row. One of the teenagers who had laughed that first night. He was seated quietly, waiting. When their eyes met for a second, he gave a small nod. It was a simple gesture, but it meant growth. She placed her fingers on the keys again. This time, there was no fear hiding in her chest, only excitement. When she began to play, the hall once again filled with music. But the story behind the sound was different now. The girl who had once been mocked was no longer proving anything. She was simply sharing what she loved. And the audience listened, not because they were surprised, but because they respected her. Years later, people would still talk about that first night. Not because the performance was flawless, but because it carried a lesson that stayed with them. Never assume someone's ability based on appearance. Never let laughter decide your limits. And never walk away from something you love just because others do not understand it yet. She would always remember the feeling of sitting at that grand piano for the first time. The fear, the courage, the first real chord. That moment had shaped her more than any applause ever could. Because in the end, it was never about stunning the crowd. It was about discovering her own strength. And once she found it, no whisper could ever take it away again.